I think, or at least one way of wrestling with this, is to begin asking the question, what kind of person was Jesus, or what understanding did the historical Jesus have of what we call personhood? And here we have to begin by going into Aristotle, because it was the Greek understanding that was prevalent at the time, or certainly becoming prevalent. And in the philosophy of Aristotle, and a number of you will be aware of this already, these are 3 or 4 of the key features. That as Aristotle was trying to reclaim and redefine human nature, anthropology, our understanding of the human, this is all on your page, number 5, you don't need to write it down. These were certainly some of the key characteristics. That each one of us as a person is autonomous. We carry from within ourselves the meaning of our existence that defines our identity. So autonomous and self-reliant are fairly similar. Those 2 points. Then this word separate, and it was at the beginning of that quotation from Elizabeth Johnson. Now this has enormous implications for justice, and particularly for what we call today eco-justice, or geo-justice. That you cannot do justice to human beings unless we're also doing justice to the huge ecological and environmental questions of our time. Because Aristotle's preoccupation was that he perceived human beings to be too enmeshed in nature, and that we need to separate ourselves over from it and over against it. So for Aristotle, human beings have souls. Trees don't have souls. Now he did concede that animals had souls, but have a significant inferior quality from human beings. So Aristotle has this big thing that we're too enmeshed in nature. We had been for thousands of years previously, and that in a sense is what makes us unique. We're earthlings. But clearly Aristotle, in developing his philosophy and becoming more and more kind of cerebral around it, was extremely uncomfortable with that idea. And that's what the word separate denotes. We do not belong to nature. We're over against it. And nature is inferior compared to the superior intelligence and superior spirituality that we have as ensouled creatures. So that's what that word separate. It's a loaded word. And it's where huge dualistic divisions began to come into our understanding of faith. Equally, the word rational, a hugely problematic word here. So rational is you work out the truth of things through the power of reason. And a number of you will know, maybe many of you know, Aristotle went on to say, in human beings, men have that capacity fully. And women don't have it at all. That's Aristotle. Check it out. That's Aristotle. When I said this about 10 or 15 years ago at a seminar in Los Carlos in Cebu, the Philippines, I was nearly lynched. I mean, even one man came up and said to me, one of the professors, he said, Aristotle is a saint. You don't criticize Aristotle in public. That's what he actually said to me. So you see the problems we have here. And you know, if the truth are to be told, this may sound a very harsh, judgmental statement, but I'm saying it in the sense that I think at times we have to name things to bring about change. You know, if the truth are to be told, why the Catholic Church will not ordain women, I suspect it goes right back to this stuff. They're not full human beings. A frightening thing, again, in the Philippines, and I'm told you also see it in Venezuela and in other countries, men can distribute communion, but women can't. Very common in the Philippines. Men have it. Women somehow don't. So you see, this stuff, it needs to be renamed so that we can somehow begin to get rid of it. And if we don't rename it, even though people say, well, why are you going back harping about all that stuff? Well, it needs to be renamed. so that then we can begin to do something about it. So yeah, that we're rational. Now, of course, there's a positive side to it. I'm not denying that. But there is this baggage attached to it. And then from all that comes the concept of the individual. Now, this is the understanding of the human person that's used all over the modern world in our educational systems. Even among tribal peoples, we try to indoctrinate them with this. An interesting little story. When my order opened a house of formation in South Africa, this would have been around 75, 76, when we were getting a number of South African men joining us. And they were all in their mid to late 20s. They weren't teenagers. And we built it the same as European seminary. We gave each student his own room. It was very interesting for the first 6 months to a year, and then of course they became indoctrinated. But their reaction was, putting a guy on his own in a room? No, you put 2 or 3 people in a room together. See, the Ubuntu of Africa. I am because we are. Their whole anthropology was different. But we weren't capable of recognizing it, never mind respecting it. So yeah, so this is our educational system, this is our politics, this is our economics all over the modern world. We take this stuff completely for granted. To such an extent we never really question it in the way it should be questioned. So, you'll probably see where I'm going with all this. I'm going to go on to suggest that Jesus not merely totally rejected this, but never lived out of it himself. And that's exactly what he's saying to the disciples of John. And so it begs the question then, what was the self-understanding of the human that Jesus was maintaining and upholding? And I'm going to use the modern kind of statement from humanistic psychology. I am at all times the sum of my relationships, and that is what confers my identity. That's what gives me identity. I don't get identity from being a lone, autonomous, separate, rational creature. I get my identity from the web of relationships. And so Jesus, that's what he's saying to the disciples of John. No point turning me into it being an individualistic Aristotelian hero. I am about something very different. Now, in ordinary human terms, each one of us can see the meaning of this. We come into the world through a relationship. And who we become as children, as teenagers, as adults, is very heavily dependent on how we work out relationships. But you see, a lot of the time we don't give much thought to that because we're so indoctrinated with this other stuff. I remember one time giving this talk in London, and this guy who introduced himself as a microbiologist with specialization on neonatal development in the womb. That's what he claimed his area of specialization was. And he said, I'm disappointed that you've skipped that prenatal stage. Because he said, on close observation of what's happening to the child in the womb, there's a massive number of field influences at work. Field influence is a concept from physics. And unless all those field influences are working very collaboratively together, you won't have a normal, healthy baby. In other words, what he was saying is the whole process of development in the womb is dictated by relationships. And then, of course, I suppose a corollary to that in our time, and you can look this up, he has 1 or 2 very inspiring YouTubes. A man called Sebastian Sung, S-E-U-N-G, who operates out of MIT. S-E-U-N-G, Sebastian. He's one of the leading names in the new brain science. And he has coined this phrase, the connectome. C-O-N-N-E-C-T-O-M-E, connectome. And basically his thesis is very simple, that we can't be any longer searching for brain centers related to speech or related to hand movement or related to muscles or related to whatever it might be, that we need to view the whole brain as a very complex interweb of relationships. That's the brain science of the future, he says, for which he has coined the word connectome. So in a sense, he's saying the same thing, as this guy in London that was challenging me about the development of the womb, that it's relationships that guide and direct the whole thing. And so here we have it at the heart of our faith, that Jesus takes on and identifies with this relational approach to things, not this linear individual thing. And so in the field of spiritual accompaniment, and I know some of you work in that field, when we use a statement like a personal relationship with God or a personal relationship with Jesus, I think we need to stop and ask ourselves, what meaning of person are we operating out of? I fear at times that we are in danger of projecting onto God, or projecting onto Jesus, this stuff. And so there's a huge piece of homework to be done there. Now, this language that I have on the screen here, personal, impersonal, and transpersonal. So I haven't heard it so much in recent years, but certainly throughout the 1990s, when I was working here in the United States, around the area of the new story and the new cosmology, every now and again somebody or some people would say, but that understanding of God is terribly impersonal. You know, I believe in the person of Jesus, a personal faith. See, that's another dualism. It's that dualistic splitting, which I think gets us nowhere in the long term. And so how do we bridge the dualism? Well, one way of bridging it is what we call the transpersonal, which I know has a variety of different meanings, but this is one of its meanings. And for now, that's what I'm holding to. I am at all times the sum of my relationships, and that is what confers my identity or gives me identity. And so this new companionship thing takes on this whole relational meaning of identity. Now, one practical consequence of this, so we're getting now closer to the challenge of the justice work, is this very interesting piece of work by Elizabeth Liebert, who is a sister down here around this part of the world. She works, I think, in Southern California. And she has long been involved in the Ignatian method of spiritual accompaniment. But in the past 5 to 10 years has made a huge shift. And this is our latest book, The Soul of Discernment. The subtitle of which is A Spiritual Practice for Communities and Institutions. And I give you this quotation, it's at the end of your page, so you don't need to write down the quotation. And the quotation is, the appearance of structures on a global scale is tantamount to the emergence of a new species on Earth. That it almost feels like a new species. And then I would partly interpret that by saying we've been called to a whole new way of being human now. Prior to the last 100 years, there were few examples of global spanning institutions. And the word institutions is a bit unfortunate there, I think. I prefer to put in the word structures, because institution has that kind of negative connotation, or at least can have, of global spanning structures. In other words, what she's saying is there seems to be a whole new awakening or a whole new evolutionary development towards communal processes. And that then is a very powerful connection with my suggestion that we reclaim the kingdom of God more in communitarian, organic terms. Now, one example of this, of course, is in the development of the United Nations back in the mid-40s, when they realized that, okay, so we have put together a kind of a confederation into which we try to bring the nations of the world, but they said, hang on a minute, there are also other organizations out there which are clearly important to people's lives, and we need to bring them in too. And so they developed the concept of the NGO, the non-governmental organization, which today I would call the capacity for networking. Now, NGO has an unfortunately bad name in many parts of the world. The reason it has the bad name, because governments have been very quick to absorb them, because they feel very threatened by them. In other words, they know that there's something new going on here, something kind of subversive. Empowerment from the ground up is going on here. And that's why I think the governments find them threatening. So I find something very profound in this observation, And I've been long saying, for example, to members of religious orders, that they need to get people trained in systemic skills. Systemic skills, and we also need them in our parishes. We need them in our peace and justice groups, so that we can be more aware and conscious of what are the skills we use in group contexts that will enable us to be more empowering and challenging and inspiring for each other. And so she's moving the whole area of discernment very much more in a group direction. That the discernment within groups and among groups and the group context is critically important for the times we're living in. And in that emphasis on the groups, I would very much want to include and try to ground our various aspirations and desires for a more just world. I think that's where it fits in. We come then to number 6 on the page. And this is where I want to try and bring the material then in this last quarter of an hour down into a more practical level. So the book, that may look a bit vague there on the screen, is by Stephen Smith. He's a British worker who works for an organisation called Oxfam, which is kind of well known for its work in the poorer parts of our world. And the title of the book is Ending Global Poverty. In there he has 8 suggestions to bring about, or to help to bring about an end to global poverty. And I have borrowed those 8, and I'm using them as suggestions for how we might begin to ground and implement the vision of the Kingdom of God, or this new companionship, as I rename it. What I like about this list is they look very secular when you put them up there. When you begin to unpack them, you also see they're deeply sacred. So we break through this dualism, I hope, and they help us to break through the dualism of the sacred versus the secular. I've used them on a number of occasions with religious orders, at assemblies and chapters, and I've used them once with a parish council in the UK. Very creative group who took on the challenge of looking at these 8 points. So, number 1, healthcare. And of course, people, particularly in Europe, will say, well, that's Africa, that's the Philippines, that's South America. Well, you know the story yourselves. 40 million people didn't have nothing at all until Barack Obama brought in his help. And 40 million people then became gradually more empowered, or were in the process of becoming more empowered, despite the huge opposition, which you all know. And then, of course, you also know the story of the sisters. So the bishops were opposed to it because they thought there might be clauses in there that would allow for abortion. They could only see that one issue, couldn't see the rest of the picture at all. Even when representatives of the sisters said, if you get people out of poverty and improve their conditions, the abortion rates will go down. But no, they didn't want to hear that. Instead, they scapegoated the sisters and set up this farcical investigation, which came to a farcical end, which it deserved. And it really shows the state of confusion in the country, and the great difficulties for the church trying to make sense of things. So yeah, you're now in the plight, as I understand it, where the figures being thrown around are, and there's 20 million, 25 million, 30 million. Over in Massachusetts, at one of my workshops about 2 years ago, I was using the figure of 25 million. And this gentleman who introduced himself as having something to do with the government in Massachusetts and said, I work directly in this field of healthcare. He said the real figure is 40 million, not 25 million. I notice now 25 million has been cited again, and that 25 million people are in danger of losing everything because of what's going on in this present government. Well, it's probably more than 25 million, if I'm hearing the story correctly. So yes, if people don't have basic health care, they're automatically disempowered. That's the point. Simple as that. And it really is a major issue for this country, it seems to me. And we're not talking about a poor country, we're talking about a rich country, obviously. Secondly, the same with the second point I'm making here, basic education. In most of our European countries, we hear the news every now and again of young people who fall through the cracks and end up either unemployed or end up in drug abuse or end up in whatever the problems might be. Again, if people don't have the wherewithal for basic education, they're automatically disempowered. That's the reality. Number 3 is an interesting one. A quantity of money to live with dignity. And again, I think we can too very quickly jump to the southern hemisphere and the poor parts of the world. In 2012, I was still living in the United Kingdom. And it was towards the end of the year. I was driving one day in my car, I had one of these chat shows on. A woman was being interviewed. Now, the breakdown in the economy after 2008 affected Britain less than other countries, but there were pockets where people did suffer badly. So this woman, her husband was an engineer, he lost his job in January. She was a nurse, she lost her job in July. They had 4 young children. This was the month of October in which the interview was being done. She was not eating food any day before 4 o'clock in the afternoon to ensure that her children had enough food to eat. United Kingdom, 2012. Wow. Not Angola, not Brazil, not the Philippines. United Kingdom, 2012. In other words, she did not have enough money to live with dignity. It's now coming to light in my home country of Ireland because we had a severe kind of financial meltdown in 2008. And it's now only now coming to light of the big numbers of people that committed suicide. Because they lost their jobs, they lost their homes, they lost their marriages, and a big number of people that went into debt. And particularly in the West, it's almost the most humiliating thing that could happen to you, to be in financial debt. And the efforts that people go to keep it a total dark secret. So if we're to reach these people and be there in a companionship approach or in a befriending approach, and hopefully in due course in an empowering approach, requires a lot of personal and pastoral sensitivity. So in other words, what I'm saying is this is a bigger issue than we think. And has a lot to do with gospel empowerment. Again, this number 4 is a massive issue, and I don't know even where to begin addressing this one. So we have all seen the big long queues in South Africa in 1994 and the privilege of being able to vote. And then we saw it in Iraq, and we've seen it in some other countries of the world. But the problem is, we vote, the ecosystem itself is being seriously damaged. And not everybody and everything is going to end up living in a less healthy state of conditions. In other words, for healthy people, you need a healthy environment. And the healthy environment needs to be there for the other creatures too of a particular bioregion. And without that, we're all, and the creation itself, is disempowered. Number 7, personal empowerment to realize my God-given potential. It's estimated that 1/3 of humanity, 1/3 of our species today, does not have that right or that privilege. 1/3. Which is a shocking indictment of our species. And then finally, community empowerment for participation in the wider world. And this, I think, translates into networking particularly, and has some very immediate implications for justice making. And I'll just tell you the little bit now that I'm going to repeat in the afternoon. Many years ago, when I visited South Africa and had the opportunity for a conversation with Albert Nolan, the great Dominican scholar and Dominican activist in South Africa. That's the reason I sought him out, because I myself was struggling, trying to make some sense of this call to justice. And I said to him, Albert, what can I do, an ordinary kind of guy, to become more of a justice maker, faced with these awful, massive problems of our time? And he was very quick with his answer. Join a network. Join a network. And then he went on to say, he said, you can't do anything in your own. He said, if you try to, it will destroy you. The issues are too complex. And you're just going to feel more and more helpless and powerless. And I think one of the lessons I learned from that, which in a sense I was not able to formulate until much later in my life, that discipleship of this new companionship, of this new reign of God, If I find myself in a situation where I'm totally powerless, then I can't really be a disciple of that companionship. I need to do something to try and pull myself up by the bootstraps and put myself in a position where I can begin to experience some sense of empowerment. I don't think God or Jesus intended any of us to feel totally powerless, because we can't really serve the gospel if we do. And I think that's in part what Albert was saying to me, join a network. And then he went on to talk and explain in our conversation. And so you need to go back to your spiritual director and sit down with him or with her and try to work out what network or networks should I join. Which I found quite difficult, particularly as somebody travelling a lot. I did, when I came back to Britain after that visit, I joined Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth, which I thought were and indeed are two very powerful networks. And I still contribute financially to them, but rarely get around to attending any of their meetings or participating in their activities. See, Greenpeace, just to take that example, and then I'll give you a very local example in a minute to put flesh on all this. Greenpeace is a particularly interesting example of a powerful network and a greatly empowering network. Every government in the world knows about Greenpeace. And every government in the world, as far as I can see, hates them to bits. Why? Because they're always flagging up the critical issues around environment and ecology. And some of my colleagues in London tell me, I don't know whether this be true of the United States or not, if you look carefully at the ecological policies of European governments, and particularly if you can trace the history a bit of how they wrote them up, they're all borrowed from Greenpeace. It's all the language of Greenpeace. So on the one hand, the governments hate them, but they know damn well they're telling the truth. And that's the power of the network. You know, I think Albert had it right on that one. An interesting comment he made also. He said, be very wary. He said, so that's for yourself personally. But he said, even if you're in a parish and you have a peace and justice group, that needs to be linked in with some of the bigger international ones. On its own, it can't do much. And then he said, and for God's sake, he said, be very careful. If you're in a town or a city, and there's a Catholic peace and justice group, and there's a Protestant peace and justice group, and there's a Muslim peace and justice group, this is what he said. He said, would you go and bang their heads together and tell them to grow up? That's what he actually said to him. He said that divide and conquer destroys the whole meaning of justice. Now, coming to networking, the story I like to tell every now and again, it just puts a bit of flesh. So what exactly do I mean by networking? So, 2 points. There's a book called Blessed Unrest by Paul Hawken. Some of you possibly know it. Hawken. It's a millennial project that he took on with a number of colleagues here in the United States, in which they went around the world looking at environmental networks only. They were expecting to get the project done in 1 year and then record what they saw. They wanted to look more at the international diversity, because they knew there was valuable work going on among these networks, and it really was getting little or no publicity. The project went on for 5 years until they eventually reached the 1 millionth network and decided to stop there, knowing that there's an awful lot more. 1 million networks, all making a difference. Maybe only in small ways, but all making a difference. And that's what the book is about, Blessed Unrest. And his point, and of course he makes a very interesting point towards the end of the book. He says, we seem to be awaiting a next evolutionary step now. The problem is that many of these networks are beavering away in relative isolation. What we now need to bring, it will probably take a shift of consciousness to do it, to bring things to a point where the networks will begin networking with each other. Then we will have clout. And we just hope and pray that that'll happen sooner rather than later. But yeah, 1 million networks, and that's only environmental issues. And of course the awful tragedy of media, it's not sensational, doesn't make big news, so it's never on the news. except for people like Amy Goodman and channels of that nature. So that's my first point. I think, yeah, you know, when the United Nations launched that idea of the NGO, they were really giving birth to something very sacred and very empowering. But I think we still have to realise the full potential of it. So what do I mean by networking at a very basic human level? Here's a nice little neat story. It's a square of what we call tenement houses in Glasgow in Scotland. Maybe, I don't know, 12, 15 years ago. The water starts coming in through one of the roofs, and they report it to the council. And the council say, right, we'll be out in due course. But days came and weeks came, and there was nobody coming from the council. And meanwhile, a second house, the water was leaking. And the women had a habit of gathering out in the square. There was a kind of a water fountain in the middle of the square in the evening times. So Mary shares with the group. Johnny, my husband, a carpenter, was made redundant today. Okay, says the women, let's gather a few dollars together and we'll pay Johnny to repair these goddamn roofs. Because it's obvious the council doesn't give a damn about us. And they did. Johnny repaired the roofs. And the council guy appears in due course, I don't know, some days or weeks later. And as we say in Europe, it was all lip. Lip means all this rhetoric about breach of contract. And then the union will not be too happy about this. And there will be trouble over this. And so on. And I think they use a fair number of four-letter words to tell him where to get off to. And he did. But they got a letter, the first family about 10 days later, summoning them to court for breach of contract. And the women got into the square. And they said, right, next Tuesday that court case is on. No child is going to school. And no man is going out working. We are all going up to that courthouse and we will create fuss up there. They were probably lucky they met a clerk of the court at the door. He listened to their story. He went back in, talked to the judge. And the judge invited in the whole lot of them. He said, come on in. And he said, I've made a decision. A fine of $1,000 on the council for neglect of contract. See the language. Breach of contract they were talking about. The judge used the language neglect of contract. Of fulfilling their contract. And they went out to their courthouse beaming. And I guess that was the end of their network. So networks sometimes can be very short. They're usually very spontaneous. They have minimum structure. And therefore sometimes can be overly chaotic and get nowhere. So they do need to get some of these group skills that Elizabeth was talking about to be maybe more effective. But that's what networking is. And I don't think there's any doubt about its importance for the future. As our major institutions, secular and religious, become more and more dysfunctional, I think networking is going to be absolutely critical. And I think that's where, for me almost, the word justice equals networking now. How to translate all that into action in our lives or in our communities or in our parishes is obviously part of the ongoing challenge. Okay, I'm nearly at my end. I just read these with very little comment. These are some of the big challenges then arising from this new vision, this new companionship. We are effectively looking at global transformation with a whole new sense of what it means to be incarnational people. Empowering relationships at every level is the challenge. Systemic eco-justice for planet and people alike. Communal networking to confront structural injustices, which I've already been talking to. Unconditional inclusivity, we love even our enemies, subject to one of my recent books. Transpersonal human development beyond the individualism that I talked about, this new sense of relational human identity. And then skills for empowering discernment, which is what Elizabeth Liebert and people are after. Richard Rohr, in his book The Naked Now, Richard has a way of really getting the point across fairly strongly. The kingdom of God is the naked now. It's what's really hitting us and confronting us. The world without human kingdoms, ethnic communities, national boundaries, or social identifications. That is about as subversive and universalist as you can get. But don't think about it too much. it will surely change your politics and your pocketbook. Is this what the new companionship is really about? And it's not just about people, it's about how all creatures relate. And of course this begs the interesting question, what was the worldview that the historical Jesus was operating out of? It was a way, way bigger than anything to do with kingship, it seems to me. Right, so then the bit of literature, Jesus Today by Albert Nolan. Any of Albert Nolan's writings are good of this material. If you want a more mystical kind of take, which maybe is a bit more congruent with some of the sharings we had last night, the work of Cynthia Bourgeois, which I know some of you are familiar with, and her book, The Wisdom Jesus, covers a lot of the same material, but coming at it from a very different angle. And then my own two books, Christianity's Dangerous Memory at the back, and then the sequel to it. This is an experiment that I was advised by Orbis to try out, because a lot of these publishing houses probably won't be around in 10 or 15 years' time. So this book is published by Amazon and is only available on Amazon, which has a few ethical concerns that I'm not entirely at ease with, but I decided to try it as a once-off experiment. And it is the sequel to the first book. The title is On Being a Post-Colonial Christian. And the material is somewhat similar, but I give a whole background to this field of post-colonial studies. Just a very quick word on that. Post-colonial does not mean after colonization. The word for that is neo-colonial. Neo-colonial. Post-colonial examines what they call the residue. I call it the baggage that's left over years or centuries after the colonizers have left. So for instance, and I hope this doesn't sound offensive to anybody in our group, when we priests celebrating Eucharist wear vestments that are modelled on the garments of the elite back in the 4th, 5th century Rome, that's the residue of post-colonialism. Why are we still doing that? That's the baggage. And that's what post-colonial people are onto. They're naming all that and obviously challenging us and inviting us to look at it. So why are we still writing hymns or prayers with the word king in there, applied to Jesus or to God? That's post-colonial baggage. So that's what they're naming. And it's a growing body of study. Again, I think Catholic scholars particularly have no time at all for them, even though a number of them are Catholic, of the outstanding scholars here. So yeah, that's the sequel, and that covers again a good bit of the material of this morning's work. Right, it's now 12:20, so I think we'll break for our lunch, and people can have some conversations during that time, and then we'll aim to get back to 3. Firstly, at the back of it, which I won't be covering, and this is mainly for people kind of at the very beginnings of trying to look seriously at a justice ministry, and I know a number of you are already deeply involved in this, but it's just a whole list of ways and means where people can make beginnings, and maybe more than beginnings. So that's why I offer that list. It's an abbreviated form from a book by Chris Sade called Second Wave Spirituality. So that's for yourselves to take away if you want to have a look at it later. So turning then to the front of the page, one or two people have said to me already today, you know, could I say a bit more about the role of the Holy Spirit, particularly in this whole concept of the empowerment and the empowering. Again, in the limited time, I think this is as much as I can offer, but I have a bit, and I think an important bit, here on this page in the first 2 numbers particularly. So the book of Genesis, in the beginning God created. There's an interesting variation on that opening passage from Genesis, which a lot of scholars are aware of. And some state that this alternative translation, they think is probably the original. And so this is from a guy called Everett Fox, who is one of the people that goes strongly for the alternative. And the alternative, and he's linking very strongly in with a woman that some of you may be aware of, Catherine Keller, from Drew University. She's a professor of theology there. At the beginning of God's creating of the heavens and the earth, when the earth was wild and waste, or maybe today we'd say chaotic, darkness over the face of the ocean, breath of God hovering over the face of the waters, God said, "Let there be light." So the point in that approach is the whole thing is kept very fluid. Everything is verbs, if you notice. Everything is moving, because that's how the Spirit operates. And Catherine Keller draws the distinction. She's trying to move away, and some other theologians are now too, from this idea of creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, to creatio ex profundis, creation out of the depths. And that fits in very beautifully with the theory of the creative vacuum in modern physics. That there always has been the fertile emptiness. Brian Swim, in some of his books, writes quite beautifully about that. And therefore there has never been a time in which there was nothing. Or, as modern cosmology puts it in a more daunting challenge, there has never been a beginning, nor will there ever be an end. It's we humans have the need for beginnings and endings. And our religions do too. So there's all sorts of challenging stuff in this opening statement here. The darksome deep is an ambivalent origin, but ambivalent in the sense of being open. In contrast to a creation under the mechanism of control and mastery that ex nihilo offers. In the beginning is formless, primal chaos, evoking the creative dab-har, the Hebrew word for word, which in Hebrew literally means word event, but can also be translated into living energy. Living energy. So in the beginning was living energy that took shape through word event. And then this guy, Stephen Service, who is a Hebrew scholar, encounter with the Dab-har implied impartation of the Spirit. So therefore, I have as a title into this page, the call to justice, the Spirit reordering creation. It would be more accurate, I'm going to rename that title, it would be more accurate to say the Spirit recreating creation. And we're all called to be part of that recreating process. Then moving on down to my number 2, the Spirit is the source of creative energy. And energy always exists. That's a basic principle of physics. You can't destroy energy at the end of the day. So the Spirit is the source of creative energy, forever seeking right relationships, or what St. Paul calls righteousness. Now, forever seeking, a more accurate way of putting that would be to have the wisdom and discernment to see the right relating that's already there, or even within the chaos, the desire for a better way to relate. It's not that we do the right relating to it. Sometimes we have to learn from the right relating that's already there in so many aspects of the natural world. Inviting us to reach out to others, and this is a quotation, in the ways we energize and empower them, especially in their needs for such things as mercy, forgiveness, justice, peace and compassion, thus our grasp on them as force fields of energy. Michael Crosby, who is at the moment dying of cancer very sadly, the Capuchin priest, Build My House, one of his last books. Now, the reason I offer you that quotation, then, so what is justice work in this deep, biblical, spirit-filled dimension of things? He describes even human beings there as force fields of energy. And you can relate that back to what I said this morning about Jesus' understanding of personhood in the relational context. So we're all force fields of energy. And therefore a foundational question then for each of us is, what do I do with the creative energy that is me? And how do I try to integrate that creative energy with the energy of other people, but also the energy that's part of the whole of creation? In other words, I'm moving here now from the concept of justice, understood as just being about human beings, to what people call eco-justice. And that you can't do justice to anybody or to anything unless we're embracing our role as creative energy makers for the whole of creation. So it's a whole new way of looking at justice. It's a whole new way of looking at creation. And it also has massive implications for what we'll be celebrating in a few weeks' time, the coming of the Holy Spirit. I think Dennis Edwards of Australia said that way back in 1994 in his book, The Breath of God and the Breath of Life. He said the Spirit didn't appear for the first time at Pentecost. The Spirit has been fully at work since the dawn of creation. So then, what are the implications of all that? We claim the church starts with Pentecost because it couldn't have started before it. We claim that we really don't have the fullness of the Spirit until we're baptized. So what were we before that? These then become some of the real important questions. Okay, so I'm offering that as a kind of a theological background, and kind of a different foundation for our approach to the question of justice. That the question of justice is itself a very profound question that deserves a more profound level for discernment in terms of theology and in terms of Scripture. In the beginning was the Spirit of Dabar. Dabar is the Hebrew word for word, or the Hebrew word for energy. The word event bringing everything into being, calling forth an empowering sense of creativity would be a better word than order. So in a word, what is justice? This is as good a definition as you probably get. It's developing the right relationships for the companionship of empowerment to flourish. That's what it's about. Now, and therefore again, coming back into my material I said about the Spirit a few minutes ago, moving beyond the anthropocentric, human-centered preoccupation with human rights. So a lot of this talk about human rights, even church documents that have been written on coming out of our own church in the past 20 or 30 years, very strong emphasis on human rights. And there's no doubt we still have a lot of work to do in that area, particularly in parts of the world where there's so much oppression. But one of my great difficulties with human rights is you can't have human rights unless you have corresponding responsibilities going with it. And everybody loves talking about rights, but not everybody likes to hear about corresponding duties and responsibilities. And that's a weakness in the system. In the last few years of his life, when he was quite a fragile person, Thomas Berry had 3 or 4 meetings with a lawyer, a solicitor lawyer from South Africa called Cormac Coollahan. And Cormac was working for the United Nations at the time, and I haven't been able to follow up on where things have gone with this one. The main reason they were working, in a sense they were working on the basis of the Earth Charter, because the Earth Charter tried to move beyond a bill for human rights to making it a bill for all rights. And Thomas and Cormac had identified these 3 fundamental rights, which are there in the Earth Charter actually. That everything in creation, not just humans, have the right to be. The plant has the right to be, the fishes have the right to be, the bacteria have the right to be, the planet has the right to be. Secondly, everything has the right to flourish. And this raises some extremely awkward questions. If everything has the right to flourish, what gives us humans the right to kill animals for meat, for example? Or to use animals and other creatures in medical experiments? No easy answer to those questions once you begin to move in this direction. And then thirdly, everything has the right to an environment conducive to growth and development. I mean, if we took those serious, we'd have to make adjustments all over the place. politically, economically, religiously, and so forth. Now, the United Nations, I know, has commenced some work on this, and Cormac has been part of the international team on it. And one of these days I might get around to sending him an email and find out what exactly is happening here on that front. But it's that shift from justice to eco-justice, as we call it. Bernie Sanders, so what I'm covering here are the different points in my number 3 on the page. And this is particularly a statement to my own church, that justice is inescapably political, systemic, and structural. So I think as Pope John Paul II was the one that had huge problems with this. Religion and politics should have nothing to do with each other. Now, to be fair, Benedict, although he was quite a traditionalist in many ways, began to change that whole approach. And Francis seems to be changing it even more significantly. And I'll offer you a few quotations from Francis in a moment. Restorative justice, there are a few people in the room that can speak to this much better than I can. This is a wonderful example of the new reign of God at work. The 2 leading countries in the world for restorative justice are Western Canada and New Zealand. The example that I learned of in Western Canada about 10 years ago, that was told to me by a sister who was on one of these teams, was of the case of this young woman in her early 20s that discovered through counselling that she had been persistently abused sexually by her father over a number of years as a child, and that the mother was also aware of the fact that the abuse was going on and did nothing about it. And so once it all came to light, she went to the police, and in the system in BC, British Columbia at the time, she was given the option, and usually, and this was one of the first major cases, of either restorative justice or go through the courts. And she opted for the restorative justice. And when her father was confronted by the courts and by the police, he also opted for it with strong advice from them. So what then happens is there are 3 teams set up. There's a team for her, there's a team for the father, and there's a team for the mother. And these teams are people with some skills in counselling, and that's all they need. They are given free legal advice, and they can call on that anytime they need it, and the police will be kept fully involved in what's going on. And the whole intention is to keep the thing out of the courts. And that is dealt with a view to restoring the right relationships. So the teams work over a period of time with each of the 3 individuals, trying to prepare the way for an eventual reconciliation. So one of the first things, she needs something like $5,000 for professional counselling. He says he can't provide that, so then the team working with the mother works diligently with her so that she can get a part-time job. And in about 2.5 years after the whole thing starts, the £5,000 is handed over to her. Meanwhile, she has had a lot of counselling and raised the loan from the bank to pursue that, knowing that this money was coming. Once that bit is done, there's then the preparation for her with a direct encounter with the father. And that's the beginning of the reconciliation within the family. And that takes, I think it took about 6 months between the various members of the internal family. And then, when things are sorted out in the family side scene, and she's obviously on the road to a much better sense of recovery, the local First Nations group came together and had a ritual of reconciliation for themselves with the family present. In other words, it was the group acknowledging this is not just the sin of an individual among us, or even of a family among us. We have all contributed to this sinfulness. And we all need healing and forgiveness. Now, that's your companionship of empowerment at work at its very best. And this is the way forward for all of us, I think. So, in other words, the real adversarial stuff of courts and litigation and all that kind of stuff is circumvented. And as I say, we have models from New Zealand and Western Canada particularly in how this works. And it's being tried out in other parts of the world, including the United States, but usually in smaller, more minor crimes, if you like. That was one of the first that I learned of where there was major stuff taken on. And it worked. Now, I guess it doesn't always work as successfully, perhaps. And then if at any stage that broke down, of course, we're back to the courts. Because the police are involved the whole way, but they have no direct involvement. They've been kept informed all the time of what's happening. Okay. Now, we have already covered this bit that we looked at last night and again today. So I'm in number 3 on the page. The spirit of justice making involves much more than promoting human rights. It involves all organic rights and duties across the entire web of God's creation. Justice work is inescapably political, systemic and structural. Restorative justice is one of the more empowering Christian models. The Church's credibility on justice making is quite low. And I think part of the reason is because we put charity often before justice. And that's the bit and that's my last point there then. In justice making, we must distinguish clearly between charity and justice. And was it last night I gave the example of CAFOD in the United Kingdom with 110 people working, about 90 of them distributing charity, and the other 20 or 25 bombarding governments to treat the people of Africa better. And that if we put the justice first, we should have the 90 bombarding governments and the 20 or 25 distributing aid. So yeah, we need charity, particularly when people are starving and deprived. But if we don't have the justice first, we'll just keep repeating the charity and we'll never have the breakthrough. And even in our local groups, we need to keep an eye on that one, particularly this emphasis on justice. And in the course of that, maybe talk.
I brought up this point in our group, but I had previously wanted to bring it up because you had up there and you talked about right now the skills needed to do the work. But what happens to a lot of people, from my experience in working in the peace and justice movement, is that if you think that is necessary, you don't show up. You don't think you have it. And sometimes you have to go and find out that you do have some of these skills already, or that you know somebody who has these skills. And you become part of the solution, but you don't become part of the solution if you hold yourself back and say, I don't have the skills to do that. Because there's a lot more skills than just the biggie skills.
Right.
You know, and I have found in our movements that that's part of the empowerment, is discovering that you have skills you didn't even know you had. And oh wow, I can go speak. You think you can't, but you can.
Yeah.
The executive director of, I think it's St. Vincent de Paul, is Jack Tibbetts, who also is the vice mayor of Santa Rosa. So here's a young man, younger than 30, who's working in a way that he can affect change politically, but he's also doing charitable work and is a leader in St. Vincent de Paul. So I, of course, am on his mailing list. Just about anything he says, I will support. If he says, come to city council and make a presence here, then that's something I'm going to do. Or he's doing dancing for the Stars and Stripes, doing a fundraiser for the vets, for veterans, then I'm going to support that financially. At this point, I don't have a lot of time to give, but I'm a worker, and I can give money. So I look out to see who's doing what I believe in, and I support that person.
Yeah, and I think particularly for a young man like that,
Yes,
it really needs the affirmation and encouragement. Yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely.
But there was a great 19th century philosopher who said, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs.
Right.
That was Karl Marx, and I thought he encapsulated to some extent part of what was said at the end.
I think particularly when we are dealing with an issue like this, with its many complexities, its huge challenges, and the great danger of being overwhelmed at times. In an event like this, I feel it's very important that we end by returning to a silent place. Because I think sometimes we can hold in the silence and can be held in the silence in a way that can be very life-giving and affirming. So I'm going to suggest that we end the workshop, the seminar, with 5 minutes of sitting in silence.